December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor burned, but 300 miles to the northwest, the submarine USS Trout drifted in silence off Midway Island. Inside, her crew ran peacetime drills during a war they didn't know had started. When the radio brought them the grim news, Lieutenant Commander Frank Fenno Jr. ordered his aging Tambor-class boat to battle readiness. Their mock patrol had become real, and by nightfall, the men of Trout were among the first Americans to glimpse the widening front of the Pacific War. Trout had left Pearl Harbor in late November 1941 on what was meant to be a routine training mission, a simulated patrol near Midway. But everything changed on the morning of December 7th. When word of the Japanese attack reached them, Lieutenant Commander Fenno immediately shifted his men to wartime operations. That same night, Trout's lookouts spotted flashes on the horizon. 2 Japanese destroyers were shelling Midway's defenses. Trout raced through the dark Pacific, hoping to intercept the enemy. But by the time she reached the island, the destroyers had vanished. For the next 2 weeks, Trout held station off Midway, the lone guardian of America's western outpost. At dawn, she slipped beneath the waves, and by night, she surfaced to scan the horizon, as her sound operators strained to separate the hum of Midway's dredges from the heartbeat of distant propellers. No other targets appeared. On December 20th, Trout returned to Pearl Harbor. Her watch was quiet, but during those first uncertain days, when U.S. defenses were thin, Trout had held her post. Her next mission would send Trout thousands of miles west, on a mission no submarine had ever attempted. By January 1942, the situation in the Philippines was dire. American and Filipino troops under General Douglas MacArthur were trapped on the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor. Japanese bombers struck The Rock in Manila Bay daily, and its defenders were running dangerously low on supplies. The call for help reached Pearl Harbor. Corregidor needed resupply, and USS Trout was chosen for the job. The submarine was hastily stripped of every non-essential item. Even most of her torpedoes were offloaded, leaving just 1 per tube to make room for cargo. Fenno and his crew were assigned a top-secret mission to resupply the besieged fortress of Corregidor. On January 12, 1942, Trout slipped out of Pearl Harbor carrying 3,500 rounds of 3-inch anti-aircraft shells bound for Corregidor. Escorted partway by a destroyer to guard against enemy raiders, Trout refueled at Midway on January 16th before entering Japanese-controlled waters alone. The crossing was rough. High winds, freezing spray, and heavy seas tossed the submarine as she pushed west. But by late January, Trout was skirting the Bonin Islands, south of Japan. In the early hours of January 27th, her lookouts spotted a light. As Fenno closed to investigate, 3 more lights appeared. Cautious but curious, Trout fired 1 stern torpedo, her first shot of the war. It missed, and the lights turned out to be a small Japanese subchaser that was soon chasing the American submarine. For over an hour, Trout ran as the enemy tried to close in. When the enemy drew within 3,000 yards, Trout crash-dived and slipped around the chaser's stern in the darkness before making her escape. The encounter was a stark reminder of the danger the crew now faced. Days later, Trout approached Manila Bay with her precious cargo and rendezvous at The Rock. On the evening of February 3rd, Trout reached her rendezvous point off Corregidor. At 18:30, a small torpedo boat crept from the darkness. PT-34, commanded by Lieutenant John D. Bulkley, whose bearded, swaggering crew had been running nightly supply missions through Japanese lines. Bulkley guided Trout through the minefields into Manila Bay, threading the submarine toward the besieged fortress. At 19:30, Trout moored at South Dock under the cliffs of Corregidor as Japanese aircraft droned overhead. Her crew immediately began unloading the 3,500 rounds of ammunition. Forming a human chain, sailors and soldiers passed crates, hand to hand across the pier. Corregidor's exhausted defenders received the shells with relief, As the cargo came off, Trout rose higher and higher in the water. Fenno realized that his boat would lack the ballast to safely submerge and requested 25 tons of sandbags or rock to compensate for the lost weight. But on Corregidor, every sack of sand was as precious as ammunition needed for shoring up defenses in the ongoing siege. Instead, an extraordinary alternative was proposed. Weeks earlier, as Manila fell, Filipino officials had evacuated their nation's treasury, gold bars, silver pesos, and securities to Corregidor. Paper currency worth over $60 million had already been burned to prevent capture, but tons of precious metal still remained sealed inside the tunnels of the rock. Now, with Trout needing weight and the government desperate to save its fortune, the two problems found a single solution. Under strict secrecy, the submarine took on 20 tons of gold bars and silver coins as ballast. Sailors formed another human chain passing 40-pound gold bars, each worth about $23,000 at the time, down into Trout's torpedo room in battery spaces. Then came 630 canvas bags of silver pesos, each packed with 1,000 coins. Officers also handed over boxes of securities, documents, and diplomatic mail. By 3 a.m. on February 4th, Trout had loaded roughly 320 gold bars, about 9 tons, and part of the silver. With daylight approaching, the submarine hid at the bottom of Manila Bay, while Japanese aircraft hunted overhead. After nightfall, Trout surfaced once more to complete the transfer. By the time she slipped her moorings, the submarine carried nearly 10 tons of gold and 13 tons of silver, the entire hard currency reserve of the Philippines. At 04:00 on February 5th, Trout crept back to sea. Fenno sent a brief coded message. The mission was complete, but their voyage home would be as perilous as the one in. With Corregidor astern, Trout was ordered north to hunt enemy shipping before returning to Pearl Harbor. But the weather turned savage, with monsoon winds off Formosa, whipping the sea into chaos. On February 10th, Trout's sonar team detected propellers. Through the rain and mist, a 4,000-ton Japanese freighter appeared, alone and plodding at 7 knots. Trout pounced. Her first torpedo missed, but the second struck amidships. The freighter slowed, and Trout closed to 600 yards before firing again. Another explosion followed, then 4 distant blasts as the ship's boilers blew apart. The enemy freighter, later identified as the Chua Maru, sank beneath the waves. It was Trout's first confirmed kill of the war. On the night of February 11th, as Trout threaded through the Bonin Islands, her lookout sighted a light. Fenno suspected a trap, and as he closed in at periscope depth, torpedoes suddenly flashed past the hull. The Japanese had set an ambush, one vessel showing lights as bait, while another running dark-fired torpedoes. Fenno dove to 120 feet as more torpedoes skimmed overhead. In retaliation, he fired 2 of his own that missed in the storm-tossed seas. Then, tracking the enemy's zigzag, he loosed a final shot. A thunderous detonation followed as the enemy patrol vessel was blown apart. As a second attacker raced in, Fenno took Trout deep. Moments later, the contact faded. Exhausted but triumphant, Trout sailed on toward Hawaii. On March 1, 1942, she rendezvoused with the destroyer USS Litchfield, dispatched from Pearl Harbor to escort her. Few knew what the submarine carried in her hold. On March 3rd, after 51 days at sea, USS Trout entered Pearl Harbor, ending one of the strangest patrols of the war's opening months. When she tied up alongside the cruiser USS Detroit, naval officers and Treasury officials gathered as gold bars stacked like bricks, and clinking sacks of silver coins were hoisted up from the submarine's hatches and into the morning air. In all, Fenno's crew delivered 20 tons of treasure into U.S. custody, the most valuable ballast ever carried by an American warship. One gold bar had gone missing in the frantic loading at Corregidor. It later reappeared in a civilian official's luggage in San Francisco. The Philippine government's wealth, its entire hard currency reserve, had been saved from enemy hands and would later be returned after the war. For security reasons, Trout's mission was kept secret for several months. Then, in May 1942, Time magazine broke the story, "Gold from Corregidor." The tale of the little submarine that carried a nation's fortune electrified the public. Admiral Chester Nimitz called it a mission that only a submarine could have accomplished, recognizing that Trout had done more than just fight. She had sustained an army, humiliated the enemy, and lifted morale across a wounded navy. On March 18, 1942, the entire crew, 70 officers and men, received the Army's Silver Star for gallantry, presented by the U.S. Army's Hawaiian Department commander. Lieutenant Commander Frank Fenno himself was awarded both the Navy Cross and the Army's Distinguished Service Cross, the latter personally recommended by General Douglas MacArthur. It was one of the rare times a naval officer was decorated for heroism by both services. Trout's second war patrol also earned one of the first Presidential Unit citations of the Pacific War, honoring her for extraordinary heroism. It was, in every sense, her golden patrol. The first two war patrols of USS Trout stand as proof of what American submarines could achieve in the darkest months of the Pacific War. Lieutenant Commander Frank W. Fenno, Jr. went on to command Trout through two more patrols, earning a second Navy Cross for a daring mission into Japanese home waters. Later, in command of USS Runner, he earned a third Navy Cross, adding to a record that also included the Silver Star. By the time he retired as a Rear Admiral in 1962, Fenno was among the most decorated submariners of the war. USS Trout herself continued her service under new captains, including Lieutenant Commander George "Red" Ramage, who would later receive the Medal of Honor. Before her loss in 1944, Trout completed 11 patrols, sank 23 enemy ships totaling nearly 87,000 tons, and earned 3 Presidential Unit citations.